Welcome to Chapter 5. In this chapter, we are going to introduce our first organ and organ system, the integumentary system, aka the skin. So we've worked our way, we started with chemicals, and then we worked our way up to cells. Cells build tissues, and tissues are now building our organs and organ systems for us. So let's get started. Here are a few of the learning outcomes that you need to be responsible for by the end of this lecture. And just a few more. Make sure that you are familiar with all of these outcomes before your next exam. Okay, let's talk about the integumentary system. So first off, what integument means is skin or outer covering. And it's not just a human term. This is in animals and insects and all sorts. It's just outer covering to protect you. So that's our organ, is the integument or the skin. Largest organ in the body, by the way. The integumentary system, the entire organ system, is the skin and all the things that attach to the skin or grow out of the skin, such as your hair, your nails, and then several different glands we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about sweat glands and oil glands and earwax glands and all sorts of different glands. But here, this last bullet point is the most important part of this entire chapter, the whole theme. You're going to hear me say this over and over and over and over again. The whole theme is protection. Does the skin do a lot of cool things for us? Yes, but it's all in the name of protection. We're just going to have different mechanisms of protecting against different dangers, I guess you could say, in the skin. So protection, protection, protection. So let's begin by talking about the layers of the skin. Another name for the skin, as I mentioned, is the integument. An additional name for the skin is the cutaneous membrane. So recall what a membrane is. It's just a barrier separating two things, right? With the skin, it's separating your outside environment, the outside world, from the inside of your body. So skin, cutaneous membrane are interchangeable. The skin has two primary layers or primary sections. We have the epidermis and the dermis. So whenever you see this prefix epi, this means on top of. So it makes sense that the epidermis sits on top of the dermis. Now let me show you what these look like on the image on the right. So what I'm drawing currently, these squiggly lines in purple, is the demarcation or the border between these two structures. So we have the epidermis is just this top portion right here. And then the dermis is pretty much the rest of it. All of this kind of circled or squared off in purple. That's all the dermis. So you can see that the dermis is much, much thicker, much larger than the epidermis. The epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue, and that should make sense, right? Because we talked about epithelial tissue mainly lining things, and this is the very, very outside or superficial lining of your skin. Now, bonus question. The main job of our skin is protection. So yes, we want protection on the inside, but we really, really need protection on the outside. So what type of epithelium are we going to have on the outside tissue, on this epidermis? So basically the question I'm asking you is, out of all the epithelial tissues we talked about, simple stratified squamous, simple stratified cuboidal, simple stratified columnar, transitional, pseudostratified, out of those 8, which one has the main job of protection? And hopefully you're saying stratified squamous. Stratified squamous is those layers and layers of pancake cells, and all their job is to do is not let things in and out for protection purposes. So that's the epidermis. At least most of it is like 90% of it stratified squamous. As we go deeper into the connective tissue, we're going to see all sorts of cool things, all sorts of excuse me, as we go deeper into the dermis, I'm reading while I'm talking. As we go deeper into the dermis, we're going to see a lot of connective tissue. But guess what? You're also going to see the other two primary tissues. You're going to have nerves in the dermis. If you cut your skin really deep, it does hurt. You do feel that. We're also going to have muscles in the dermis as well. But mainly, we're going to just have a lot of varying different types of connective tissue, as you will see. And then last but not least on this slide, I want to point out the DEJ, or the dermo-epidermal junction. And basically that's that purple squiggly line. That's that border that I showed you. It's where the epidermis and the dermis meet. And that's going to be very important to pick out in histology to tell you the differences between the tissues. Basically, you get that huge change of pattern when you're looking at these structures in the microscope. And that huge change is separated by this what we call basement membrane in some cases, or in this particular case, the DEJ, dermo-epidermal junction. On this slide, we're going to discuss the difference between thick skin and thin skin. And this is kind of misleading because we're really just talking about the epidermis here. Now, I know on the previous slides, we just mentioned that the dermis is way, way thicker than the epidermis, right? The epidermis is just that kind of outside layer. We have some stratified squamous protecting us, and that's really it. But when we talk about thick and thin skin, we're just comparing the epidermis in different areas of the body. The dermis is there regardless. So there are two main locations in your body where the skin is significantly thicker than the rest of your body. And you can feel the back of your elbow, the back of your knee, you can feel your neck and your belly, and you can try to find this area. And probably most of you already know where this is. The palms of the hands and the bottom of your feet, the soles of your feet, are the only places where we have thick skin. And believe it or not, your fingertips as well. We can add that in. So palms of hands, bottom of your feet, and your fingertips have extra layers of epidermal tissue to give it, once again, protection. So think about it. If you're to give your body protection in only 3 locations, it would probably make sense that your feet and hands are covered, right? And your fingertips. That's pretty good locations, because if we're working out in the field, right, before we had technology in the Industrial Revolution, pretty much almost everyone, a lot of folks worked the land for a living to feed their family. So if you're walking around barefoot, because we don't have brand new Nikes and you don't have gloves, you are wearing down your feet and hands and your fingers constantly. So it's pretty cool that we're designed to have this extra layer of protection in those areas so we can handle work and stresses such as that. So everywhere else in the body, like I said, knee, shoulder, neck, belly, back, whatever, that's going to be considered thin skin. Hands and feet are going to be your thick skin. So if you take a look at the picture on the left, you can see once again the dermo-epidermal junction. I'm highlighting the basement membrane, or the junction, in black. And the epidermis here, pretty thin. And then you look at the picture on the right, and it's just a lot of crazy stuff going on, many, many more layers, a lot thicker. So that's the comparison. A couple more things to add about the epidermis. Once again, it's the outer layer. It's the most superficial layer, pretty thin compared to the dermis, the large part of the skin. We're going to have several different cells throughout the epidermis. We're going to introduce that very shortly, and their functions. And then once again, their tissue type is the stratified squamous epithelium. And remember, we talked about the difference between keratinized stratified squamous and non-keratinized last chapter. In your skin, you're going to have that protein keratin to make this extra strong, right? Because we want protection. Versus areas like your esophagus or the inside lining of your mouth, you don't need as much protection. It's not as tough as your skin. So that's going to be non-keratinized. So we're going to see the word keratin a lot this chapter, and you can see some of the cells. Actually, the most popular cells in the epidermis are called keratinocytes. So if you had to guess what those do, you'd be right. They make keratin. On this slide, we're going to introduce 5 different types of cells that are involved with the epidermis. And what you're going to see is all 5 of them have very unique different functions. But at the end of the day, when you sum it up, all of these 5 unique functions are all for protection in one fashion or another. So let's talk about these different ones in order. First, we have the basal cells. And the basal cells are your stem cells. Now remember what a stem cell is from our tissues chapter, last chapter. Stem cells are cells that are very good at mitosis. Now what I'm doing here is I am circling at the very bottom of the picture. I'm drawing a few purple circles, just giving you some examples of what basal cells look like. They're these little square cuboidal looking cells. And what they're going to do is basically make new skin for you. So whenever your skin dies, we start making new skin. Right? Therefore, we don't run out of skin. So these are the stem cells, and this is why you constantly are regenerating skin. And if you get a tan or if you cut yourself, give it a month or so, and it will more than likely go back to normal unless the damage was severe. So those are called basal cells. Next cell are keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are these cells that you see kind of in the middle of the picture. I'm going to put them in green. You can see with them with the little nuclei everywhere. These are all keratinocytes. And their job is to basically protect you. These cells are made just basically full keratin. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to purposely kill the live cells in our skin and our epidermis. And how we're going to do that is we're just going to pump them full of keratin. And basically keratin is going to kind of take over the entire cell to the point where the nucleus and the mitochondria and the Golgi apparatus no longer work. And therefore, if those organelles aren't working, they die. So that seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Like, why would we want to kill our own cells? Well, let's think about it. Yes, the nucleus, mitochondria, all that stuff is good for us, but if our main goal is protection, wouldn't we want the strongest stuff that we can possibly make in that area? And that's what we're doing. So these basal cells make your skin cells at this bottom layer here. And then as new cells are made, those cells get pushed up. And then as new cells are made, those cells get pushed up. And then you see where I'm going here. Basically, we have this pattern where the older the cell is, the closer they become to the surface. And as we get to this surface area, our only job is protection. Because when a bug climbs on you and bites you or stings you, or when you scratch yourself, you want protection on your skin. You don't want to bleed every time you touch your skin. So that's the purpose of the keratinocytes. Let's move on to the Merkel cells. The Merkel cells are nerve cells inside of the epidermis. And you can see this weird looking blue cell at the very bottom right corner of the picture. That is a Merkel cell. And what they're responsible for is detecting touch, specifically what we call tactile touch or light touch. We're going to have a different type of cell in the dermis that detects kind of a deep touch or a pressure. But the Merkel cells are light touch. So this is the wind kind of blowing against your hair. This is a little ant crawling on you. This is you wearing your watch. It's kind of scratching you a little bit. You just put a shirt on in the morning and the tag on the collar is kind of itching you. That light touch sensation are the Merkel cells telling your brain, hey, something's touching my skin. Now, as I mentioned, the theme is protection, right? How do these things protect you? Well, you want to be able to feel stuff crawling on your skin, right? Especially if you're outside in the woods or something. If a tick jumps on you, hopefully you feel that tick jumping on you so you can swat it or, get rid of it, flick it, right? So this is still a form of protection. It's just to let your brain know, hey, what's going on? Next, we have the Langerhans cells. The Langerhans cells are the only cells that you can't see in this image on the right, but I have a really cool picture coming up for you, and I'll show you what they look like and what they do. Basically, these are your defenders of your epidermis. These are basically, they're not lysosomes, but they work like lysosomes. They're just big macrophages is what they are. They just kill things. They just eat things. They're kind of like this octopus-looking structure with these tentacles, and the tentacles grab on the things, and then they just swallow it up. So they eat bacteria. They eat any foreign particles in your skin. They even just eat flakes of dead skin that are just kind of swimming around. So this is the immune part of your epidermis. So when you go outside and you scrape your knee or you scrape your elbow, it's not a 911 emergency. Yes, your skin is meant to protect you, but you have a backup plan. You have actually several backup plans. And one of your backup plans are these Langerhans cells. So when you scrape yourself and kind of lost a couple layers of skin, you're okay. You're not going to die of a septic infection, hopefully, right? And then last but not least are the melanocytes. And the melanocytes give you your skin color. They give you your hair color. They even give you your eye color. And you can see a melanocyte in this picture, circled in red. And basically, this is just a pigment. And everybody's a little different, really, depending on your parents. And your grandparents kind of dictated this for you. But if your parents live near the equator, somewhere in South America or Africa or Southeast Asia, you're probably dark skinned, you probably have dark hair, you probably have dark eyes. If your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents lived in Canada or Norway or Russia, somewhere like that, you probably have lighter skin and you might have lighter colored hair, lighter colored eyes. It just depends on your genes. It's a big part of this. So we'll talk more about all of these in just a little bit. Now, one more thing I forgot to mention is the melanocytes. How do those protect you, right? The basal cells protect you because they make new cells. Keratinocytes protect you because they're tough. Merkel cells let your brain know what's going on. Langerhans eats things. How do melanocytes protect you? Well, the more melanin you have, the darker your skin, the darker your eyes, the more protected you are from the harmful UV radiation of the sun, right? Somebody with light skin, such as myself, I have to be careful when I go out in the sun. I have 6 members in my immediate family. 2 of them have already been diagnosed with skin cancer in my lifetime because my family has very fair skin. Somebody who is of South American, African descent, you don't really need to worry about that. You have really, really dark skin. You're kind of protected. It's very, very rare to get skin cancer if you have dark skin. So protecting you from the harmful UV light. Sun rays are good for you. Go out in the sun. Just don't overdo it. Let's dive into a little more detail with all of these epidermal cells. We're going to skip basal cells because we've already covered really the essence of them. They're stem cells, and what they do is make these cells, the keratinocytes. So keratinocytes, once again, very, very important because that keratin serves as our main form of protection. This is by far the most abundant type of cell in the epidermis. So out of all of these cells, the basal, the Merkel, the Langerhans, and the, what am I missing? Melanocytes, these are by far the most popular, the keratinocytes, all throughout your skin. And once again, keratin, very, very strong protein found in your skin, also in your hair and nails. And what it does, because it's so strong, it protects your skin and also waterproofs your skin. So when we take a shower or bath or jump in a pool or something, we don't swell up with water like SpongeBob or something, right? We need to protect, we need to have that barrier between the outside world and the inside of our body. So keratin helps with that. Now, as I mentioned, these keratinocytes are born thanks to those basal cells in that last layer, that bottom layer. And what happens is we purposefully kill our cells, if you will, and this process is called keratinization. And what we're doing is we're just pumping the cell full of keratin. And once again, all of those organelles kind of die in the process of this. But that's okay because it's really it's the outside layer of our skin. Its only job is to protect you. And this is the best way, number 2, this is the best way to protect you, is to just make the cell really, really tough and hard. So by the time these keratinocytes are actually dead and they get to the very surface of the skin, they do change names. They're called corneocytes. And corneo just refers to, it means horn. And if you look under the microscope, a lot of times these structures at the very, very top next to the lumen, they just kind of have these little horns to them, these kind of just edges to them. So that's where they got the name from. So keratinocytes, main purpose, protect, because they're really, really strong. They don't let stuff in and out of your body. The Merkel cells, once again, this is the nerve cell in your epidermis, and we talked about they are really responsible for light touch. And you have this all over your body. You have this on your face, your neck, but specifically we have a lot of these in our hands and feet, which kind of makes sense, right? We need to know what's going on. Every time you take a step, we need to make sure that our brain knows where our feet are, right? And your hands need to be very sensitive as well. As we're typing and texting and doing all the things we do with our hands, it's good to have very sensitive nerve fibers in that area. Next, we have the Langerhans cells, and the Langerhans cells do have another name. They're also known as epidermal dendritic cells. And recall what dendrites are from the last chapter. We looked at them with the nervous system, or the neuron, and basically it's a cell and it's got kind of all these octopus spider leg looking things kind of branching off of that, and that's what we're looking at here. You can see some of these cells on the right that have these extensions on them. So once again, these kill things. They work with our immune system. They actually are a part of the immune system. These cells are born in the bone marrow, and then they migrate to the skin, and they work as macrophages. They just eat things. So there are receptors pretty much on everything. Recall back in chapter 3 all those glycoproteins we talked about. And if your receptors don't match the body's receptors, or if something's receptors don't match with part of the body's receptors, we're going to try to eat you or kill you, right? And that's unfortunately where autoimmune conditions happen, where the body doesn't recognize its own parts of the body, so it attacks it. But that's what's happening here. So if something was to get in your skin, like a foreign object, your body's going to do the best it can breaking that down and trying to destroy that, and that's the role of the Langerhans cells in the epidermis. And then we have the melanocytes, and once again the melanocytes produce this pigment called melanin, and that gives you the color of your skin, hair, and eyes, and once again it's protecting you from the UV radiation, the harmful UV radiation. So now that we've covered the cells, we can jump into the different layers of the epidermis, also known as stratums. So if you look at the picture on the right, you can see the basement membrane, or what we call the dermo-epidermal junction. This time I'll do it in green, where you can see the tissue just drastically changes. So this would be epidermis, and this would be dermis. So in the epidermis, we have 4 to 5 layers. It depends on what type of skin we're talking about. If we're talking about thick skin with the palms of the hands and the bottom of the feet, we have all 5 stratums present. And you can see here we have the order. We have the stratum corneum is the very, very top, or most superficial. That's actually what's touching the outside environment, if you will, or what the air is surrounding. Then we have the stratum lucidum, followed by that a little deeper is the stratum granulosum, then the stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale, or that basal layer. Now, this is thick skin. Thick skin has all 5 layers. In thin skin, what happens is usually the stratum lucidum is not there, and all the other layers are just a little thinner. They're just not as thick. So with the thick skin, all the layers are a little thicker, and then we have this extra layer called the stratum lucidum. So, do you have to know the order of the epidermal layers. You do, yes. But it's real easy to remember. Just make a mnemonic and you can figure out a way to put these in order. Just like we did with PMAT, with mitosis a couple chapters ago, right? Prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase. All we have to do is if we take the first letter of each layer, let's just make up some type of rhyme or some type of saying, and it'll help you remember it. So the one that I was always taught was, come, let's get some bacon. And if you remember, come, let's get some bacon, yes, it's silly, but you know the order. It goes CLGSB, corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basale. Now, once again, in the case of thin skin, though, this stratum lucidum is not present. So in that situation, we would just come get some bacon. So those are the 5 layers, and what we're going to do on the next 5 slides is talk about each specific layer and what's unique about it, why they're important. So let's work our way in order, going from superficial to deep. So come, let's get some bacon. Come, the first one is stratum corneum. And remember those corneocytes at the very, very surface of the skin, they make these shingle-like appearances, and they kind of look like horns. And you can see couple of these horn-looking structures at the very top of this micrograph right here. That's where they get the name. So this is a layer. It's actually several layers. They can range up from 20 to 30 layers thick. This is by far the thickest layer of the epidermis, the corneum. And what these are all dead cells. These are all corneocytes. So all those keratinocytes, excuse me, pumped the cells full of keratin, they killed them, and now basically what they're doing is they're just migrating up to the surface, getting ready to be flaked off. So all cells in the stratum corneum are dead. They do not have a nucleus. They don't have active organelles going on inside the cells. Now, this once again does provide a waterproof barrier and also just a barrier in itself from debris, bacteria, fungus, all that stuff as well. And this is the stuff that you actually shed. When you scratch your skin or when you roll over in bed on your pillowcase and on your sheets, you shed this stuff. And the average person, believe it or not, sheds about 40 pounds of skin in a lifetime. So depending on, average age, you shed about a half a pound a year, maybe a little bit more than that, of dead skin cells, of these stratum corneum cells in a year. So when you're, and also when you're looking at somebody, when you're looking at your wife or your husband or your boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, you're mainly looking at a bunch of dead cells on the surface. That's what it is. So they have the saying, beauty is only skin deep. It's kind of funny because most of the cells that you're looking at, and if you're touching somebody's hand, they're all dead. They're all dead cells. And that's the stratum corneum. Next we have the stratum lucidum. And the stratum lucidum, very similar to the stratum corneum, is just a bunch of dead cells. Just a bunch of dead cells. But remember, the unique characteristic of the stratum lucidum is this is only found in thick skin. So it's only found in the palms of your hands, soles of your feet, some fingertips, right? That's it. Or when I say some, all fingertips. And the reason why we get this name stratum lucidum, lucidum actually translates into light. So it's this lighter, more transparent, clear layer found just under the corneum. And its main job, yes, even though the cells are dead, it's just extra layers, extra layering for, once again, protection. Moving right along, we have the come, let's get. So G is for stratum granulosum. And the reason why it's called granulosum is because we have a bunch of granules, these little like specks all throughout the layer. And that is part of the process of making a whole bunch of keratin in this layer. Because, my friends, this is where keratinization occurs. This is where we are actively starting to pump the cells full of keratin for protective purposes, but remember the side effect to that is we're killing the cells essentially. So the two layers above this, the stratum lucidum and the stratum corneum, both dead. Layers of cells that are dead. This is where they start to die because of this keratinization process. So every layer below or deeper to the stratum granulosum, the spinosum and the basale, the cells are going to be alive and kicking. Every layer above this, they're going to be dead. This is kind of that transition part. Next, we have the stratum spinosum, and the stratum spinosum is named because under the microscope, with a lot of magnification, these flat pancake cells appear to have these spines attaching to them, and these spines are called desmosomes. And the way I always picture desmosomes is they're kind of like rubber bands. They're just really, really strong rubber bands, real thick rubber bands. So what's the purpose of a rubber band? It's to be strong while under stress or while stretching, right? So if I'm grading your lab quizzes or something and I got 20-something pieces of paper, and then I have another class come in and do the same assignment or quiz or whatever, lab quiz, and another 20 pieces of paper, I need to be able to stretch that rubber band and slide in the other 20 pieces of paper. So now I have 40. Right? So that rubber band is able to hold that stretching position while being strong and hopefully not breaking. And that's what these desmosomes do. They allow, there are these junctions between these cells, and they allow stretching and movement to occur without the cells and the tissue becoming damaged. The only other place where we have this type of protein, these desmosomes, are in your heart tissue, your heart cells. And think about what your heart has to do on a 24/7 basis. It fills up with blood, so those cells are stretching, and then they have to forcefully contract and pump that blood out to the rest of your body. So they work as rubber bands. They constantly stretch and contract. And we're also going to have a lot of RNA in this area to help the prep stages of making the keratin. So remember on the previous slide, or the stratum right above this, we have the stratum granulosum. That's where we are going through keratinization. We are pumping the cells full of keratin. Here in the stratum spinosum, we're preparing it. We're kind of getting ready to do that. And remember the very important role of RNA in our cell chapter. RNA is what's going to help us translate that message from a bunch of ACGs and U's, ACGs and U's to the actual amino acid, right? And a bunch of amino acids will make our protein. And that's all keratin is a protein. Then we have the stratum basale. Let's get some bacon. So this is the very last stage, or the last part, the deepest part of the epidermis. As soon as you go underneath the stratum basale, you are officially in the dermis. And it is made up of a different type of epithelial tissue, as I pointed out earlier. So 90, 95, 99, whatever percent you want to use, by far the majority of your epidermis is stratified squamous. But this very, very bottom row is made up of simple cuboidal epithelium. And once again, these are stem cells. So they're heavily mitotic. They make your new skin cells. And then what's going to happen is, as these cells get born, get kicked out, they eventually just keep getting pushed by newer cells and newer cells and newer cells, and eventually, like I said, they eventually just flake off in your bed sheets or your pillowcase, whatever. Our next topic is epidermal growth and repair. And remember, the main function of the epidermis and really the skin is protection. So we have this term called turnover time or regeneration time. And what it is, it's basically a measurement of time, seeing how long does it take for a cell to be born, a keratinocyte to be born in the stratum basale, and move all the way up the layers, up the stratum spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, corneum, and then eventually flake off. And the average turnover time is about 35 days. So if you're fair-skinned like myself and you go out and get a nice tan during spring break or summer, and then you stop going out in the sun, you'll notice that your tan only lasts for about a month or so, and then it goes away. And the reason why is because you got those nice tan cells at the bottom of your epidermis, and then they flaked off, and your new cells, the melanocytes, don't really change over time. Your genetics is your genetics. So that's kind of how long it takes. If you notice, only about 10% of the cells in the stratum basale actually go through mitosis on a daily basis. So your epidermis grows in clusters. It's not the entire skin making cells every day. It's just portions. So if we have a group of cells, cuboidal stem cells in the stratum basale, they'll go through mitosis on a Tuesday, and then they'll get a week or two off before they go through mitosis again. So it kind of just moves in these different clusters. And you take a look at the last bullet point. If we have a shortened turnover time, we have a callus. So if we're not allowing our skin to have enough time to regenerate, basically we're just putting too much strain or abrasion or pressure on the skin, what will happen is we'll irritate it and we'll get this callus formation, or in bad cases we can actually just break through the skin and get a blister. And then once again we come across the dermal epidermal junction, also known as the DEJ. So just a review slide here. We talked about it's basically the boundary or the barrier between the epidermis and the dermis, gives support to the epidermis. And as I mentioned with the blister, if we were to damage this area, so if we're way past the callus, what would happen if we disrupt the DEJ, we can actually get a blister. And sometimes blisters can form with water, sometimes they can actually form with blood, as you can see in this case in the picture. Now that we have covered what we need to know about the epidermis, we can move deeper into the skin, or what we call the true skin, also known as the dermis. And the reason why the dermis is true skin is because most of the cells, unlike the epidermis, they're alive here, right? The stratum, corneum, and the lucidum, mostly dead cells, and the corneum was by far the largest layer. Here, the cells are alive in the dermis. As I mentioned earlier, yes, the dermis is composed of a lot of connective tissue, but we are going to have some muscle here as well. You'll see in this picture we have a muscle actually attached to that hair follicle right there in green, if you can see that green. There we go, a little better. We're also going to have nerves as well, so we're going to have many primary tissues here. The good news is we had 5 layers in the epidermis. We only have 2 in the dermis, so it's a little easier to remember. We have a papillary layer, which is the more superficial layer, and it's very, very small. And then we have the reticular layer, and that's a lot deeper and a lot larger too. So you have the come let's get some bacon, and then you have PR. So come let's get some bacon in Puerto Rico, or whatever PR you want to remember. Many different functions of the dermis, and we're going to cover these as we move along the slides. Protection is always going to be the main theme, no matter what. Protection, protection, protection. But as you can see, we do some other cool things. We're going to store water and electrolytes. We're going to have also more nerve fibers in the dermis, not just those MERKEL cells, but we're also going to have other cells. We're going to help regulate temperature in this area because we can manipulate blood flow. And we're also going to talk about those sweat glands, oil glands, other glands, and we'll talk about hair just for a little bit as well. So let's get started. The first layer or superficial layer of the dermis is called the papillary layer, and as I mentioned, this is by far the smallest layer. What we're looking at here is a picture of the skin, and that blue area here, this is the epidermis. Okay, and I'm drawing the basement membrane right here. So then this area in black, just this kind of area that kind of hugs next to that basement membrane, that dermo-epidermal junction, that is the papillary layer. And then everything else, all of this mass in red, is going to be that next layer, the reticular layer. So it's significantly smaller. Made up of loose connective tissue, collagen fibers mainly going to be found in this area. And as I mentioned, it kind of hugs against the epidermis, that dermo-epidermal junction. And as we're going to see very shortly, this is what's responsible for making your fingerprints. Kind of a cool slide to talk about the papillary layer. So the indentations, as I continue to draw this dermo-epidermal junction, if you look at the bottom picture, you see this kind of up-down wavy fashion all throughout the skin. And these finger-looking structures that I'm highlighting in green that kind of indent into the epidermis, those are called dermal papillae. And that constant curving of the papillae is what causes these ridges or these lines everywhere called friction ridges. And this is what's responsible for your fingerprints. And as you can see, everybody has a unique fingerprint because, I mean, there's just, look at the picture, there's just thousands and thousands of these tiny lines and they're all oriented a little differently. So these ridges allow us to grip things and manipulate them within our hands. And the reason why we have fingerprints, and we actually leave a fingerprint behind like on a book or on a spoon or whatever we're touching, is because of tiny, tiny, tiny microscopic sweat glands on our fingerprints. And they leave behind an imprint. And that's why you can't really do too many crimes in America if they have your fingerprints, because it's once you leave evidence, they'll track you down. Now that we've talked about the papillary layer, we can move on to the reticular layer. The reticular layer, once again, is the very massive layer. It's by far the largest part of the skin, both dermis and epidermis. And we're going to have dense irregular tissue here. We're also going to have a little bit of elastic fibers, but it's mainly going to be collagen. So we're going to have some areolar tissue dispersed throughout this dense irregular as well. And we're going to have all sorts of things. Once again, this is the largest layer of the skin. So this is where we're going to have most of the party happening. We're going to have a lot of different muscles. We're going to have hair follicles. We're going to have sweat glands, oil glands, blood vessels, nerve fibers, all sorts of crazy things going on. So let's talk about a few of these structures in the dermis. On this slide, we're going to discuss the sensory receptors, or the nerve endings throughout the dermis. Remember that, yes, our main theme is protection, but we can also protect ourselves by letting the brain know what's going on around our skin. So as you can see on the bottom, we can sense all sorts of different feelings and sensations, such as hot, cold, pressure, pain, touch. And what I want to do is I want to point out a few of these structures and relate them to the different sensations. So, I'm trying to find them. Okay, here we go. Took me a while, but a little bit. So if you're looking at the picture, you're seeing this purple circle. What these are called are free nerve endings. So I'll just put a free before this. Free nerve endings are responsible for detecting 3 of these sensations you see. They're responsible for detecting temperature, so hot and cold, and pain. Goes to something called a free nerve ending. And what that means is the nerve is exposed. The nerve is naked. Basically, you just have this structure and the ends of the nerve aren't protected, or what we call encapsulated. So these detect hot, cold, and pain. And that kind of goes hand in hand, right? If something's too hot, it can cause pain. And same thing with something too cold. Now, something that is not considered a free nerve ending, or let's say a bunch of nerve endings all wrapped together in a unit, is called a corpuscle. And I'll show you it in green here, kind of towards the bottom part of the picture. What you see is you see a nerve fiber, and then it kind of coils in on itself, and it makes this kind of loop-de-loop, swirly looking structure. What that is called, once again, is a corpuscle. So let me clear this up. I'll spell it for you. Corpuscle. And there are 2 types of corpuscles I want to introduce to you. The first one is called a Pacinian corpuscle, and we'll do that in green because that's what the circle is in, and you can see it right here, the spelling, and that is responsible for detecting deep touch or pressure, same thing. So a Pacinian corpuscle, deep touch. So we also have corpuscles that are oriented in the exact same way. We'll do that in blue. So it's just a big loop-de-loop, swirly looking thing. And that is responsible for detecting light touch in the dermis. And what those are called are Meissner's corpuscles. So as you can see, a big theme in anatomy is when people discover this stuff, they tend to name it after themselves. Langerhans cells, Pacinian corpuscles, Meissner's corpuscles, Merkel cells, all those things. They're people's last names. So Meissner's corpuscles detect light touch. Now don't get Merkel cells confused with Meissner's corpuscles. They both start with M, and they're both detecting light touch, but the Merkel cells were really kind of hugged right up against that dermo-epidermal junction. They're in the epidermis, and the Meissner's corpuscles are found here in the dermis. So recap, the free nerve endings detect hot, cold, and pain. The Pacinian, P for Pacinian, P for pressure. How about that? The Pacinian corpuscles detect pressure or deep touch, and then the Meissner's corpuscles, similar to the Merkel cells, detect light touch. So yes, we have connective tissue all throughout the dermis. On the previous slide, we just talked about a bunch of nervous tissue throughout the dermis. And here we're going to talk about muscle tissue throughout the dermis. So we have two types of muscle in the dermis. Obviously, we don't have cardiac, right? So we're going to have the remaining two, skeletal and smooth. Remember, skeletal muscle is voluntary. And this is kind of unique because most of your skeletal muscles are not going to be found kind of within the skin. They're going to be found under the skin, for example, in your arms, legs, abdominal, back region. But in the face area, these facial muscles are actually located in the dermis. There we go. I couldn't find my mouse for a second. So once again, voluntary with skeletal muscle, and therefore this is going to help us with facial expressions. This is going to help us smile and frown and laugh, and all of those tiny little intricate muscles that we're going to learn next module are going to come into play here. Now there also are involuntary muscles in the dermis. We call those smooth muscles. Specifically, the name of the smooth muscle is the erector pili muscles. And these muscles actually attach directly to the hair follicles, and when they contract, they actually pull on the hair follicle and cause the hair to stand straight up. And we see this whenever we're freaked out, or when we're cold, or when we're just emotional, right? Good moving movie or speech or something. I get goosebumps when I watch sports sometimes. I'm weird, I don't know. But it's just it's an emotional response. So this is due to the smooth muscle contracting, pulling on those hair follicles, making the hair actually stand up on your skin. We're also going to eventually get to the hair follicles, and then the sweat glands, oil glands, that kind of stuff. But as you can see in the notes, a little more information on this coming up. We just want to throw it in here because we're giving you an overview of the dermis at this point. And we're also going to cover this in more detail later on as well, but we can control temperature with the dermis. We have a lot of very, very small blood vessels called capillaries, and your nervous system can actually dictate or manipulate if the blood goes to the skin or goes away from the skin. And if blood actually goes to the skin, it's going to actually warm your skin up, cause some sweating potentially. And if it goes away from the skin, it's actually going to make your skin rather cold. You might get some of those goosebumps we just talked about. So we'll get into a little bit more of this in just a bit. Another characteristic with the dermis is growth and repair. And unlike the epidermis, the dermis doesn't actually have to regenerate and make new cells all the time. Remember, the epidermis, we're constantly making new cells in that stratum basale because those cells in the stratum corneum are constantly shedding off, right? And we're killing them in the stratum granulosum. So with the dermis, though, we only get this rapid mitotic activity or regeneration when we cut ourselves, when healing needs to take place. So in that situation, what happens is, remember, we have a lot of dense, irregular, and areolar tissue in your dermis of your skin. So we have a lot of collagen fibers and a few elastic fibers. So the stem cells that make those fibers that we talked about in the tissues chapter are your fibroblasts. Remember, stem cells that make protein fibers. So in the case of wound healing, yes, we do need to repair these things. We do need to make new protein fibers to repair the skin. And in the odd situation that the wound is pretty significant and we're not able to make those proteins fast enough, what we basically do is just put some duct tape on the situation. I currently have some duct tape and zip ties holding my bumper together because I don't want to pay for brand new fibroblasts because they're expensive. So I'll put duct tape on the car for now, and it doesn't look pretty, but it works. And that's kind of what your body does, is it'll lay down this scar tissue, this kind of fibrotic mesh tissue, and it gets the job done. It holds it together, but sometimes from a cosmetic standpoint, it can leave a scar. And then at that point, it's really hard to clean that up and regenerate new tissue. Another cool thing that can happen with the dermis is the appearance of stretch marks. And stretch marks occur when elastic fibers get stretched, and really it happens when they get stretched in a very short amount of time. So this is very, very common, as you can see in the notes, in pregnancy. Very common, right? During first trimester, a lot of moms aren't even showing. Some don't even know that they're pregnant. You fast forward 4 or 5 months to your third trimester, and the mom's about to pop, and that skin over the belly region has stretched significantly in a very short amount of time. So a lot of times what you'll get is these tiny white scar-like looking structures, and that's just due to overstretching of the skin. In the picture, you can see this. This never happened to me, good or bad, I don't know. But you can see kind of these white streaky lines in this gentleman's axillary area. And that's because this guy just got jacked real quickly. He hit the bench press or did a crazy amount of push-ups in a very short amount of time. And his muscles hypertrophied. His muscles grew very, very quickly. And his skin had a hard time catching up. So that can happen a lot of times with bodybuilders, weightlifters, football players, those kind of guys. And females, you can get this too. It's just I have a picture of a guy. So nothing long-term, nothing serious. This is not going to cause symptoms. It's more of just a cosmetic thing to be aware of. Deeper to the dermis, or underneath the dermis, we have another layer of tissue called the hypodermis, and that should make sense, right? Hypo means underneath or less than or below. So other names for the hypodermis are the subcu layer or the subcutaneous layer, and also superficial fascia. And remember, we talked about fascia a little bit, mainly that loose areolar tissue that kind of packages organs and cavities, just kind of lines everything. So it makes sense that the hypodermis is mainly made up of loose areolar fibers, and actually a lot of it really is just fat. And you can look at this picture right here, all the way below the dermis, you see all these kind of yellow looking circular structures, and those are the adipocytes from adipose tissue. And remember, we talked about the functions of adipose tissue, one being keeping us warm, temperature regulation, right? Another one is for energy storage. In case we don't get to eat every few hours, we can tap into our energy stores, fat. And 3, it's just cushioning. It's just protection. Just like every other thing in the skin, our main goal is protection. This is no different here in the hypodermis. It can serve as a form of protection. It's also going to connect the other skeletal muscles below the skin to the skin. So if you wanted to see your biceps muscle, what you would do is you would cut through the epidermis, then the dermis, and then the hypodermis, and directly under that hypodermis fascia region, you would actually get to muscle tissue. Next, we'll talk about skin color, and skin color is determined by melanin. Remember that pigment from the melanocytes, but it's not how many melanocytes you have. Whether you have light skin, dark skin, it doesn't matter. Everybody on Earth pretty much has the same amount of melanocytes. It's the quantity. It's how much melanin you're spitting out, right? So if I do have light skin and I go out in the sun for a while, I'll just make more melanin temporarily. But as you'll see in the kind of middle area, the reason why skin color doesn't change that much over time is because it's genetic. Heredity is the primary factor. As I mentioned, folks born near the equator, or their parents, grandparents born near the equator, they're going to have naturally darker skin. Folks that were born or have ancestry closer to the North and South Pole are typically going to have lighter skin. So things that can temporarily affect melanin is things like sunlight. As I mentioned, go out, get a tan. Even if you have really, really dark skin, your skin can become darker by just simply going out in the sun. Cool things, your hormones can play some weird tricks on you. If you have some type of adrenal gland issue or even a pituitary gland issue, you can release excess amount of hormones, which can cause this kind of bronzing looking appearance. And it sounds cool, but it's not. It means your hormones are messed up, so you don't want that. And then, of course, aging definitely plays a role in your skin color. As we age, we get these age spots. You're more likely to get moles and benign tumor-like looking structures. Also, your hair changes color, right? Your hair starts graying out basically because there is no melanin left in that hair. Now, there are other things that can affect the color of your skin that are not called melanin, and these are just non-melanin related changes that are temporary. Blood flow. Blood flow is very easily seen. If you deprive somebody of blood flow of oxygen for a little bit, if they're in really cold weather, their skin can turn kind of a bluish color, right? Or their lips can turn blue. If somebody's really, really hot, you go out for a jog and they're fair-skinned in the summer, their cheeks and everything will get really, really red, right? And that's just because there's a lot of blood flow to the skin during that time, trying to get rid of that excess temperature in the form of sweating. Other things, I mentioned the cyanosis, bruising. Bruising can happen where you get a yellow, green, brown, black and blue, just purple, all sorts of different colors with bruising, bleeding inside the skin. If you eat a lot of carrots and squash or drink a lot of vegetable juice, you can temporarily change the color of your skin. You can have this kind of orangey glow to you depending on how many vegetables you consume. If you have jaundice, if you're going through liver issues, liver failure, your skin can kind of have this glowy yellow looking appearance or orange looking appearance. And then hemoglobin. Hemoglobin in our skin, if you look at the palms of your hands, regardless if you have light skin or dark skin, certain parts of our body are a little different, right? The palms of your hands are not the same color as the back of your hands, and that's just because of blood flow in those areas and capillaries, and, right, you have thicker skin in your hands too. How we actually make melanin is a pretty neat process. It is stimulated and dictated by hormones, and a very important amino acid comes into play, something called tyrosine. It's just one of those 20 amino acids that eventually build into different proteins. Now, the pigment is released into these little packets called melanosomes, and the keratinocytes take up the melanin and kind of form this shield or barrier. Remember, why melanocytes are so important is because the darker your skin is, the more protection you have from the harmful UV radiation. You don't really have to worry about skin cancer as much as somebody who's more light lighter skin. So what happens is, as you're out in the sun, the keratinocytes get stimulated, and then they send a message to the melanocytes, and then it just kind of gets the whole ball rolling. Now, as I mentioned, everybody on Earth has pretty much the same number of melanocytes. It's the quantity of melanin, it's how much melanin you're spitting out, and also the type of melanin you're spitting out. So there are two types of melanin, and you can see the difference in the picture between somebody who's darker skin versus somebody who's lighter skin. But the two types are eumelanin and pheomelanin. And eumelanin typically exists in darker skinned folks with darker hair, darker eyes. And then the pheomelanin is more of the lighter skinned folks. Also folks who have more red hair, orange hair. So just a couple cool bullet points about how we actually make melanin. Once again, this can slow down in your hair drastically as soon as you hit your 30s, really. That also depends on genetics, but average, once you hit your 30s, you can lose some melanin in your hair. Hair starts turning gray, that kind of thing. All right, let's dive into the accessory structures of the skin. We'll start talking about hair and some of these sweat and oil glands that I've been mentioning. This slide is just an overview of some of the appendages we're going to talk about. Hair, we know what hair is, but it covers our body all over the place. But it is interesting to note that where hair is not always present, areas such as the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, lips, nipples, and parts of your genitals, right? Nails are just really, they're appendages of the skin, but they just really, really concentrated areas of keratin. And once again, keratin's a very, very strong protein. So the more keratin you have, the stronger something is. Your nails just have a whole boatload of it. And then we're going to talk about different glands. We have sweat glands, and then we have this thing called the sebaceous gland. And I've been just calling it an oil gland, but you do need to know the proper name for both sweat and oil. We'll introduce sweat in just a second. But an oil gland is the exact same thing as a sebaceous gland. And then we're going to talk about ceruminous glands as well. And ceruminous glands are just a fancy way of saying your earwax glands that help you make earwax. And yes, all of these have a purpose. All of these have a function that we will talk about. A little information about the hair follicle here. What the hair follicle is just a tube inside of the skin that the hair actually sits in. And this is where actually the growing is going to occur, and it's going to push the hair up. Because once we actually get hair, like the hair that you can actually see on your head, on your arm, on your face, whatever, that is dead. That's just keratinocytes, dead keratinized cells. But inside of the follicle, we do have some live cells. And it comes from an enfolding of both the dermis and the epidermis. And they call those the root sheets. Another structure called the germinal matrix. This is where the growing actually occurs. It's a cluster of cells at the very bottom of the hair follicle. And you can see them right in this area right here in purple, also known as the hair matrix. And it's formed by the stratum germinativum. Say that real fast. That's just another fancy way of saying the stratum basale. So these are mitotic cells that make keratinocytes, and then it's the same exact principle. As new cells are being made, the old cells are getting pushed up, and that's how your hair actually grows. And of course, what keeps them growing is blood flow, right? We need oxygen and nutrients for pretty much anything growing and metabolizing and living in our body. So we have capillaries from the papillary region of the dermis that kind of protrude up into the hair, what we call the hair bulb actually. It's the very bottom part where it kind of gets bulky, and that's where we're going to find nice capillaries to bring us those good oxygen and nutrients. Next we have the sebaceous gland, and as I mentioned earlier, a sebaceous gland is the exact same thing as an oil gland. And what oil glands make is something called oil, right? We know that. And what a sebaceous gland makes is something called sebum. So sebum and oil are also interchangeable words. They mean the same thing. Now, the functions of oil. Why do we want oil on our body? That's kind of, why would we want that? Well, one, it's to hydrate us. It's to lubricate our skin. Now, it just depends on what part of the world you live in. If you live in the southeast United States, it's pretty humid most of the year. You really don't need that much lubrication. It's just wet outside all the time. But if you live out in a more arid or desert-like place, you need lubrication. Your skin will dry out, it will crack, and it puts you at more susceptibility to infection. So we want lubrication to our skin. Also, secreted in the oil itself are a lot of cool antifungal properties, also antibacterial properties. So I'll just put BACT for back and then antibacterial. So as the oil is secreted and eventually gets to the skin, it kills natural residing bacteria and fungus. And once again, you see a theme with hair and thicker epidermis, and same thing with oil. This is this is found everywhere except the palms and the soles of the feet. Right? We have oil everywhere in our body. Some places more than most, right? Face tends to have more oil than anything else. You don't want your face drying out. But everywhere else also do have sebaceous glands as well. Next, we have sweat glands, and the anatomical term for a sweat gland is a sudoriferous gland. And by far, when comparing all the glands of the body, such as earwax glands, oil glands, mammary glands, whatever glands we're talking about, by far we have way more sweat glands than anything else. And what the sweat is actually composed of is mainly water. By far 90, 95, even 90, in some sweat glands, 99% water. Because the main job of sweat is to what? Generally speaking, we sweat to cool us off, right? Hot temperature, we're getting too warm. So what we do is we essentially pour water on the outside of our skin. And it's the same thing if you're getting hot outside. If you were to take a bottle of water and pour it on your skin, as long as that water is less than 98.6 degrees, it will have a cooling effect on you. And that's essentially what we're doing. If by sweating, if we cool the outside of the body, we're hopefully cooling down the inside of the body. So mainly water. Now, there are other things that can be released in the sweat. Yes, it's mainly water, but this is a way of detoxing. We can get rid of waste products through the skin. You can see some examples here. Ammonia. Generally speaking, your liver and kidneys are able to handle ammonia. And what we do is we take ammonia and we turn it into urea in the liver, and then we urinate urea. We'll talk more about that next semester. But those two substances are waste products. They can become toxic if they build up in the body, but we have inner mechanisms to get that flushed out. But in some trace amounts, you actually can sweat out ammonia. You actually can sweat out urea. We can also, obviously, we know we sweat out salts, right? We lose a lot of electrolytes when we sweat. We can also sweat out alcohol. We can sweat out drugs. We can sweat out a lot of different things. It is a way of getting stuff out of the body. Recent research in Scandinavia, Finland specifically, Finland, I just forgot the name of the country, is really, really cool research coming out with the crazy benefits of sauna usage and the lowering of heart disease, heart attacks, also cancer incidences are being shown with sauna usage. And it's not as crazy as you think. It's really, really hot. I mean, it's 175 degrees Fahrenheit is like where the study highlighted it, or highlighted the number. But it's really not that much of a frequency. It's 20 minutes a day, 3 to 4 times a week. That's it. So every other day. Every other day, sit in a very, very hot sauna for 20 minutes. And they're saying, and this was a 30, 40, 50-year study. They tracked these people throughout more than half their life, and they saw a significant decrease in heart rate too, blood pressure issues, but also heart disease and cancer incidences with these folks. So sweating is good. We are able to get rid of toxins through our sweat. Now, what causes our sweat to be stinky sometimes is mainly these sweat glands down here, the apocrine sweat glands. And because we have bacteria all over our body, what happens is bacteria love to eat the stuff that the apocrine sweat glands actually sweat out. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's go in order of the two types of sweat glands. We have eccrine sweat glands, and then we have apocrine. Some people pronounce it apocrine, not incorrect. You can say it either way. So an eccrine sweat gland, this is absolutely mainly water. This is by far, this is 99% water. It's 1% salt and waste. Pretty much everything else is water. There's also a little bit of vitamin C in that 1% as well, which is a natural antioxidant. And we have these sweat glands everywhere except your armpit, your areola area, which is the nipple area, and your private parts, your genital anal area. So as you can see, I'm highlighting in green with the apocrine. Apocrine, these sweat glands are going to be located in those stinky parts, armpits, anal, genital area. Everywhere else that's not those, we have these eccrine sweat glands. So these are the sweat glands on your forehead. These are the sweat glands in the crease of your elbow, the crease of your knee, the sweat glands on your back, the sweat glands on your belly, the sweat glands in your feet. Everywhere is pretty much eccrine sweat glands. And they're mainly secreting water, same thing to cool you off. When we get to the apocrine sweat glands, it's a little different because, yes, we're secreting water, but we also have a more yellowish secretion to the sweat because we're also sweating out fats and proteins in this type of sweat gland. I'll just put prot for proteins. So the bacteria that live in those areas, specifically your armpit and your anal area, your genital area, love eating that stuff, and then they release gases, and that's why you smell funny. That's why you have BO, body odor. And we all do, right? But to compare these two sweat glands, let's say I go outside and I run a mile really fast, right? And I get really, really sweaty. Yes, I'm going to smell, but if you smell my forehead or if you smell the back of my knee, it's really not going to smell. That doesn't have a scent because the stuff coming out of my forehead is 99% water. What is going to stink is my armpits and my private parts, right? Because that's where this fat and protein is being released in these apocrine glands. So as I mentioned, the bacteria just love to eat on that stuff. One more thing that I want to point out is the areola. Now, do we actually sweat out of the areola nipple area? No, not quite. I mean, I'm sure there are some sweat glands around that area small, but what this is referring to are the mammary glands. These are specialized sweat glands. And because they are, the reason why we call them specialized sweat glands is because the histology is pretty much the exact same. If you look at a mammary gland secreting breast milk versus a sweat gland secreting sweat, it's pretty much the same thing. It's simple cuboidal cells lined up in a circle or arranged in a circle, and they secrete the contents into that central lumen. That's it. So the glands that release breast milk are pretty much the same in structure and function, except the only thing we're not releasing sweat, we're just releasing milk. And that milk has a lot of fats and a lot of proteins for that baby to grow, right? So that's why we have that weird exception in this category. This slide's just a review slide. We've already talked about this, right? Sebaceous glands are oil glands, which make oil, or aka sebum. I highlighted that they have antifungal and antibacterial properties. And because oil is essentially lipids, remember that water and lipids don't mix well, so it's going to prevent us from losing too much water. And they're generally associated with hair follicles, so what happens is the gland is connected to the follicles. You can look at the pictures both on the left and right. Here is the oil gland, and it literally just secretes the oil on to the hair follicle. And then it just kind of works its way up onto the hair and then onto the skin. And what can happen, as we know, at least I know, as a teenager and as you age, stuff can get plugged up. Your body maybe can secrete too much oil. And what that can cause is a blockage, and then your immune system has to attack it, and that's basically what causes acne. That's what pimples are, especially the white pus. All that is a bunch of dead white blood cells that are trying to kill, or that already killed bacteria. And same thing with blackheads. They're just a little deeper, a little more frustrating. Another type of gland is called a ceruminous gland, and a ceruminous gland is found in your ear, as you can see. So a ceruminous gland makes something called cerumen, is the exact same thing as saying an earwax gland makes earwax. Now, what is the function of earwax? There's nothing attractive about it. Why would we have it? Why do we need it? Well, kind of the same thing as oil. It's antibacterial, antifungal. I'll just put anti stuff. So if you've ever been outside or in the woods or camping or something and there's a bunch of bugs and mosquitoes buzzing around, it's really, really cool that, well, it's not cool that they bite you, but if you're getting bit all over your legs and arms, it's really cool that when they fly around your ear, they don't actually go in your ear. Or if they do, they spend about a second in there and then they get out of there as fast as possible, right? And of course, we're swatting at them too. But the reason why is because once they get in contact or once they smell this earwax, they know it's a harmful environment, so they get out of there as fast as they can. So I encourage students to not clean your ears every single day. Folks who clean their ears 7 times a week, what they're doing is they're kind of inhibiting their body from allowing this stuff to build up, and they're actually more at risk for stuff climbing in their ear or possible ear infections, believe it or not. A lot of folks actually never clean their ears. They actually just let it build up and naturally fall out of their ear. Now, I don't personally do that. That drives me, it gets a little itchy after several days for me, but it is natural to, I mean, they didn't have Q-tips 100, 200 years ago, did they? So what did they do? They stuck their finger in there, or they just let nature take its course. But it is a good thing. We do want those anti-blanks to help us fight off those pathogens. As we finish this presentation, we're going to have a lot of summary slides, just kind of bringing everything together, and this is one of them. Remember, the main theme of this chapter is protection, 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 and we can protect against many different things. I just mentioned microorganisms climbing in your ear, right? We can protect it by cerumen, different chemicals, and throughout all of the epidermis, we have those keratinocytes that protect stuff from getting in, also even just water, protecting us from water seeping into our body. Same thing with mechanical injury. To prevent us from getting cut, scraped, and bruised, we have those keratinocytes to make our skin nice and tough. We talked about the melanocytes, making melanin to protect us from the harmful UV light, right? All UV light is not bad. You want UV light. It actually helps regulate your sleep cycle. So if you're an insomniac, you should go out and get some sun. That is a good thing. Just don't overdo it is all. And then also dehydration. We talked about how the sebum, the oil, helps with water loss. Also the keratin helps waterproof your skin as well. Going along the theme of protection, we have something called a surface film, which is basically just a thin film of materials that keep us clean from bacteria and fungus and parasites and those kind of things. And it's consisting of a lot of different things. We've talked about keratinocytes, we've talked about Langerhans cells, we've talked about the sebum, the oil, we talked about sweat. And when you combine all of those things and the ingredients in your sweat and oil, basically we have this nice barrier on your skin that is very toxic to bacteria and fungus. So and also the dead epithelial cells just making that barrier, right? So things can't, the live bacteria actually can't get in. So let me get my mouse working. There we go. So we have a barrier, we have chemical components, we have the lubrication from the oil, the sweat hydrates you, well, the water cools you off, right? And then we also have chemical components. I mentioned vitamin C, I mentioned the antifungal and antibacterial properties. So even though, yes, you are swarmed with bacteria on your skin right now, I don't care if you showered 5 minutes ago, you have bacteria all over you, they aren't really able to multiply. They're not really able to thrive on your skin because of all of these things put together, all of the sweat and the oil and the keratinocytes and the Langerhans cells and everything. It creates this kind of film that basically protects us from the outside world. Now, once your skin is breached and you have an opening, all that kind of goes out the window to an extent. We still have Langerhans cells, macrophages, and immune responses to fix that, but you are at more risk of an infection. We've talked about sensations. I encourage you to review that slide where we talked about the different nerve fibers that detect different things. We talked about the free nerve endings detecting hot, cold, and pain, the Pacinian or Pacinian corpuscles detecting the deep touch of the pressure, and then the Meissner's corpuscles detecting light touch. The skin also has flexibility. We talked about those desmosomes in the stratum spinosum that allow basically that rubber band-like function for our skin to stretch a little bit. And we see a really cool trade-off here. So if our number one focus, if our number one goal is protection, why wouldn't we just make a million billion keratinocytes, right? Why don't we just make a shield around our body? Well, one, it would probably be hard to get that stuff out, such as sweat and oil, right? But two, we would lose flexibility. If we just have these really picture fingernails, if we just had fingernails all over your body, you would lose mobility. You wouldn't be as agile, as fast, as strong. So we kind of have this flexibility in our skin where, yes, it's protecting us, but we can still move and grow and lose weight and that kind of stuff. And then we talked about excretion as well. Your skin can get rid of waste products. It can. Uric acid, ammonia, urea, all things that are just byproducts of breaking down either proteins or nucleic acids. I mentioned alcohol. I mentioned drugs. Just all sorts of things our body can get rid of through the sweat glands. Now, this isn't the major role of the skin, as we know, and the liver and kidneys are really designed to get rid of those waste products, but your skin can help. And another review slide with immunity. We talked about those Langerhans cells, also known as those epidermal dendritic cells, and basically they're just macrophages, and they just chow down on anything that is foreign. Another fascinating aspect to the skin is its role in helping with the production of vitamin D. So first things first, your skin does not make vitamin D, but it does help get the ball rolling and eventually will help the body make vitamin D. So it forms an immature or a precursor to it thanks to skin cells being activated by UV light. So go out in the sun, get your vitamin D. Then there's a chemical cascade, or there's a string of reactions that eventually send signals throughout the bloodstream to the liver, and then from there the liver sends that almost ready vitamin D to the kidneys, and the kidneys just add this hydroxyl group, this oxygen and hydrogen to it, and then it is official activated vitamin D. So that it goes skin, liver, and then kidneys. Now, vitamin D is really important for calcium absorption. Now, I haven't really stressed calcium too much yet, but next chapter, chapter 6 with the skeletal tissue, calcium going to be extremely important. Probably the most important thing I'm going to talk about next chapter is why we need calcium. So vitamin D helps with the absorption of calcium. So if calcium is important, vitamin D also very important. It can be classified as a vitamin and a hormone. Remember, a hormone is just a chemical that's floating in the bloodstream. Now, it's not exactly secreted by an endocrine gland, but it is a chemical that is floating around, gets to the liver, and then that immature form goes to the kidney. So, yes, vitamin D can be considered a hormone. Now, important note for folks with darker skin, if you have a lot of melanin, therefore you have a lot of UV protection from the UV light. So, it might be harder for you to get vitamin D production. So darker skin folks need to stay out in the sun a little longer for that same effect of vitamin D. If you live in a northern climate or you just don't like the sun that much, you can also always just go talk to your doctor and see if you can get on a vitamin D supplement. Just be careful with vitamin D supplements because if you take too much, once again, they help with calcium absorption. So a lot of vitamin D, awesome, great, but if you have a lot of or too much calcium, then you could start developing some weird issues such as calcium stones in your body, kidney stones, gallstones being one of them, mainly kidney stones. Not to scare you, just make sure you talk to your physician. Our next topic is homeostasis of body temperature. So the skin helps maintain our constant 98.6, give or take a degree or so, right? And we do that by basically balancing how much heat we're making in our body versus how much heat we're losing in our body. So we are constantly making heat inside of our body. When we break down food and make it into energy, the byproduct is you release heat. So what we do is we take oxygen and our nutrient, mainly sugar, and what that's going to do is it's going to give off some byproducts. It's going to give off some carbon dioxide. It's going to give off some water. It's also going to give off some energy. That's the main goal, right? Why we eat food, to get energy. But it's also going to give off heat in this process. Activity is also going to generate heat, right? Do some jumping jacks, do some push-ups for 10 seconds, and you will get a little warmer. You might want to take a jacket off, or you'll start sweating or something like that. So as we increase activity, we increase catabolism. And that's why after a workout, you may be very, very hungry because you broke down everything you need, and you need more fuel to regenerate all those muscle tissues that you broke down and all the glycogen and glucose stores that you just tapped into. So the cells that are most active in producing the most heat or giving off the most heat is the liver, because your liver is constantly at work making sure, basically filtering all of our food products and just making sure there's no toxins in our body. And then of course your hundreds and hundreds of skeletal muscles that actually help you exercise. And then we have heat loss, and you can see that we lose a lot of heat just from evaporation and radiation. So evaporation you can see such as sweating, and of course during hot temperature days, or just even if you're in a house or an apartment or something and it's hot, you will sweat. Also humid conditions cause you to sweat. Now even if you're not actively sweating, even if you're not exercising or you're not in a hot environment, if you're just sitting around watching TV all day, you still sweat, and you actually still sweat a lot, believe it or not. As long as the room temperature is below 90 degrees, you sweat about half a liter of sweat all throughout the day. Now it's not noticeable. You don't notice it. Your body, I mean that's a bottle of water, right? But it's spread out throughout your entire body, forehead to feet, and over a 24-hour course of time. But what we call this is insensible perspiration or insensible sweating. You don't detect it, you don't feel it. But your body is constantly losing heat. It is losing water in that fashion. Another reason why you need to drink a lot of water throughout the day. So you can see that radiation is the transfer of heat from a surface to another with no contact. So we can do that by dilating the blood vessels in the dermis. Now, even though the epidermis is not exactly alive, and it doesn't have a good blood flow, that's why, I mean, other than the keratinization, that's why they're dead. The dilating of the blood vessels in the dermis make that area warmer, and that's what helps warm the surrounding tissues as well. So let's go to the next slide. I'll just show you some illustrations. So illustrations here on the left, you have a pot of coffee or something. The water gets hot, eventually turns into a gas via evaporation. The bottom left, you have the sun giving off its rays to the earth. Even though the sun doesn't touch the earth, we know we have radiation, and we know that the earth warms up with the sun. And then you got a picture of a bunch of bulldogs, English bulldogs, maybe? I don't know what kind of bulldog. But anyway, and they're all just kind of stuck together, sleeping together. And the reason why they do that is to keep the heat in, right? So they don't lose heat. It's basically a blanket effect. So how can we manipulate this? How can the nervous system control this 98.6 homeostasis? If we get too hot, what do we do? If we get too cold, what do we do? Well, if it gets too hot, we do have sensors in our skin, right? And they send a message to the brain, specifically a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and it tells the body to start sweating. So it tells those eccrine and those apocrine glands to release sweat, cool us off a little bit. But also what it's doing is this. It's causing the blood vessels at the surface, right, where that dermis, epidermis area is, it's causing them to dilate. And what dilation means is get bigger. So if this is a normal sized blood vessel, this tube, what vasodilation looks like is that. So vaso means vessel, V-A-S-O. It means blood vessel, and then dilation would be to get bigger. So what does that mean? What are we doing here? If our normal body temperature is 98.6 degrees, your blood is a little warmer than that. Your blood is around 100.6 degrees. It's about 2 degrees warmer than the rest of your body. So by opening up these blood vessels, by opening up these tubes, what we're doing is we're sending more heat toward the surface of the skin. As we send more heat to the surface of the skin, this evaporation effect takes place, and the sweat glands release more sweat. Once again, the purpose of sweating is essentially we're putting water on the skin. If you cool off the outside of your body, you're effectively, hopefully, going to cool off the inside of your body. And in decreased body temperatures, we're just going to have the opposite effect. So we're going to have receptors that talk to the hypothalamus, talk to the brain. And what they're going to do is definitely not sweat, right? We're going to do the opposite of sweating. And instead of the blood vessels getting larger or vasodilating, we're going to constrict them. We're going to squeeze on them. And what that's going to do is shunt blood away from the skin, so we're not warming up the skin. And that'll cause those erector pili muscles to contract and cause the hairs to stand up potentially, a little goosebump action. Also, skeletal muscles all throughout your body can start contracting. If it's bad enough, you can start shivering to the point where your teeth start hitting together, right? It just depends how cold you are. But what we're doing is by getting that warmer blood, that 100.6 degree blood away from the skin, we're keeping that warmer temperature where it needs to be in those vital organs. So we're going to take that warm temperature and put it towards the heart, put it towards the lungs and the liver and the kidneys. Because if we're freezing to death, I think our skin can be the first thing to go. Would you agree with me? Yeah, frostbite's not that fun, but if my heart freezes or my kidneys freeze, I'm not going to live more than a few seconds, right? So that's what we're doing there. Okay, our last topic is on burns. So I'm sure some of you have heard of or maybe even experienced some types of burns, first degree, second degree, hopefully not third degree burns, right? What we're going to do here is actually just look at the definitions and what defines the differences between a first, second, third, and even a fourth degree burn. So a first degree burn, really not that big of a deal. As long as it's not coming from the sun, not a big deal at all. All you're doing is you're burning the epidermis in a first degree burn. And most of the cells in the epidermis are alive or dead. And they're dead, right? So if you're burning dead cells, is it really that big of a deal? No, not really. So this is your burning your hand on a hot stove. This is your burning your mouth with hot pizza. Not a big deal. Your mouth hurts for a day or two, and then it's fine. And your body's brand new. You're totally okay. With the sun, that can become an issue though, because remember the UV radiation, that can cause too many first degree burns, can actually lead to mutated DNA, which can cause cancer-like activity. So there's a difference between a first-degree sunburn and a first-degree, ow, I just burned my hand on the stove for a second. You want to stay away from the sunburns. Second-degree burns, what we're doing is we are actually cooking through the epidermis and we're getting to the dermis now. So a little more serious. The big thing you're going to see with second degree is you're going to see the hallmark symptom of a blister. That's the big difference. So if you burn yourself and you see a blister, you have a second degree burn. I don't care if it's 1 blister or it's 40 blisters, 1 counts as a second degree burn. If you burned yourself really bad, but your skin didn't blister, even if it really, really hurts, and you want to say that you had a second degree burn, you didn't. It's a first degree burn. It's just a really bad first degree burn. You have to have a blister to make that distinguishing separation between first and second degree. Next, when we move down to third degree burns, unfortunately, there is no skin. You cooked through the epidermis and the dermis and the hypodermis, and sometimes even deeper. There is no skin left to burn. The skin is gone at this point. So what we're going to do now is dive into specifics of these degrees. We're also going to introduce fourth degree. The third and fourth degree pictures are kind of gnarly, so obviously if you're squeamish or you just don't like looking at this stuff, just look away, or just read the notes or the book, and you don't have to listen to the rest of the presentation at that point. But make sure that you're still responsible for the info. All right, so on this slide we have first and second degree burns, and once again, a first degree burn, you're going to get the typical symptoms of redness, maybe pain, and discomfort, but there's no blistering. So this is just a simple, like I said, burn your hand on a hot stove or a sunburn. Now I mentioned though, be sure you don't get multiple sunburns. When you burn your skin via the sun, you damage a lot of those capillaries in that dermis area, and it takes a long time to help heal that stuff. So you don't want repetitive sunburns. That's not a good idea. Second degree burns, once again, involving the epidermis and the dermis, and the big key symptom is the blister. Even though this person only has 1 blister, that is a second degree burn. And you want to make sure that thing doesn't get infected or when it pops or when it oozes out. Moving on to a third degree burn. Unfortunately, there is no skin left here. The skin is gone. We are in flesh. You see fatty tissue, you see some muscle tissue in here. There is no skin. Now, if there is one positive outlook of the situation, is when you burn through the entire skin, you burn through those free nerve endings. And because the free nerve endings detect hot, cold, and pain, that area is no longer susceptible to pain. It doesn't recognize pain. It doesn't send it to the brain. So if you were to touch the middle of this third degree burn, this would be numb to that person. However, now don't get me wrong, don't jump ahead. What I've been told is this area right here, where the third degree burn actually meets skin, is like the most painful thing known to mankind. Like sometimes they have to put people in a coma as they're cleaning these wounds or as they're healing from these wounds, because those nerve endings are freaking out and they're in so much pain. And as they start to heal, the healing part's actually worse than the injury part. So don't get me wrong. There is pain. There is a lot of pain. It's just that specific part where there is no skin. Generally speaking, no pain associated with that area. And then last, we have the really, really unfortunate situation of fourth degree burn. And with a fourth degree burn, we're just burning everything in the body. Yes, we're going through the entire skin, so epidermis, dermis, but we're also burning everything underneath that. We're burning muscle and bone tissue. And I'll try not to spend too much time on this picture, but you can see all 5 fingers are basically charred. More than likely, those are going to have to be amputated. You can see bone tissue. This white tissue right here, that's bone, and it's that's not going to be salvageable. That's going to have to come off, unfortunately. Same thing though in that area with the skin, because the skin's gone, your skin can't feel anything, there's no free nerve endings. But for the most part, you're either going to have that tissue amputated, or you're going to have some skin grafts taken from elsewhere on your body to help repair that damaged tissue. Okay, last slide. This last slide is talking about how would we assess the severity of burns. So for example, say that we're on a field trip, say that there's 20 of us or so, and we go on a field trip, and for some unfortunate reason we get an accident, the bus catches on fire, and there's 20 of us in a fire and we're all burned. Okay, we get rushed to the emergency room, and there's only one doctor and one nurse on staff today, holiday or something, so they can't see all 20 of us. What they have to do is they have to figure out who the most critical is, who is in the most danger due to these burns, and then who can sit in the waiting room for 3 to 4 hours, right? And I'm not trying to be funny or sarcastic, but we need to save the person who is most close to death at this point. So there are two ways of assessing this, and depending on what year it is and what textbook you read, these kind of alternate. I was always taught the rule of nines. That's, to my knowledge, that's the more common one, but I'll introduce both of them. The rule of nines is we separate parts of the body into 9%, and then you add it all up together. 9 times 11 equals 99%, and then you have the genital region that makes up the last 1%. So basically, we have these fractions or these pieces of the pie, and they all equal 100%. So if you are burned, for example, and you have burns all throughout your chest and belly region, as you can see, that is a very large number. That's 36%, or 4 nines, right? And then I come into the emergency room, and I just have a burn on my forearm, and then maybe a little bit on my lower leg. My number isn't going to be as high. You can see 9% for the upper limb, 18% for the lower limb. I don't have as high a score on the rule of nines as you do. Therefore, you are more critical, and you're going to be seen first, ideally. Now, sometimes, I will say this, sometimes the rule of nines will get thrown out the window if we have severe second, third degree burns to the face. The face kind of, if the eyes and mouth and nose are affected, sometimes that can overrule this rule of nines. But for the most part, we're going to add up these numbers and figure out who's more severe. The other way we can calculate who is in more dire need of seeing the physician is the rule of palms. And what that says is you take your palm, so just the area, not your fingers, but just your hand area where your metacarpals are, and that equals about 1% of your body surface. So what you would do is basically just imagine you sticking a bunch of palms on the burn site and just count how many palms would that cover. And then you can calculate who's more severe. Basically, you're eyeballing how extensive are the burns, how far throughout the body does this stretch. As I mentioned, the rule of nines, it was more common when I was learning this stuff. I've been told by EMTs that they use the rule of palms, so both are correct. It's just these are just two different ways of assessing burn damage. All right, everyone, congratulations. You have finished your first organ and your first organ system. The skin is knocked out. Let your instructor know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time for our next organ system. We're going to start introducing the bones.